December 5th, 1872. The North Atlantic is doing what the North Atlantic does best. Grey skies, cold chop, the kind of wind that cuts right through a wool coat like it isn't even there. Captain David Morehouse of the brigantine Dei Gratia is scanning the horizon through his glass when he spots something that stops him cold. A two-masted vessel, maybe 400 yards off, moving but wrong. The sails are set badly. She's yawing side to side like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. And nobody is at the helm. He knows that ship. He'd had dinner with her captain Benjamin Briggs the very night before she set sail from New York. The Mary Celeste had left port 8 days before his own ship, and right now she is sailing herself across the open Atlantic with no one aboard, or at least no one visible. Morehouse sends 3 men across in a longboat: first mate Oliver Devoe, second mate John Wright, and a sailor named John Johnson. They pull alongside, grab the rail, and haul themselves up onto the deck, and then they just stop. Because what they find is not a disaster, it's not a battle scene, it's not a wreck, it's something far stranger, a ship that looks like everyone on board simply ceased to exist. The main hatch is open, the forward hatch is open, water has gotten in, the decks are soaked, the interior is damp. One of the pumps has been partially disassembled, its components laid out carefully nearby as though someone was mid-repair and just walked away. The lifeboat, the ship's one and only lifeboat, is gone. The bow is intact. The hull is sound. There is no fire damage, no collision, no structural reason this ship should have been abandoned. She is in every practical sense perfectly seaworthy. Devoe goes below. In the captain's cabin, he finds the logbook still there, still open. The last entry is dated November 25th, 9 days earlier. Position noted roughly 100 miles west of the Azores. Nothing unusual recorded. No storm, no emergency, no distress. Just a routine entry from a routine day at sea, and then silence. The captain's navigation instruments are gone. The chronometer is gone. The sextant is gone. These are the tools a navigator needs if he's trying to get somewhere in a lifeboat. Someone took them deliberately. Someone planned to leave. In the captain's quarters, there is a small bunk built into the wall, a child's sleeping space. The impression is still there in the mattress, a small body recently present. 2-year-old Sophie Matilda Briggs had been sleeping in that bed. Her toys are still there. Her mother's little sewing kit kept for her still there. Sophie was gone. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, not just the mystery of the missing crew, but that specific detail. A mother had made that bed, a father had checked the sails, a toddler had been tucked in, and somewhere between November 25th and December 5th, all 10 people on that ship, the captain, his wife, his daughter, and 7 sailors, vanished into the North Atlantic and were never seen again. No bodies, no wreckage from the lifeboat, no distress signal, no explanation. Just a ship sailing herself through 9 days of open ocean like a ghost who hadn't yet realized she was supposed to be haunting something. The Mary Celeste had been found, but 10 human beings had simply ceased to be, and we still don't know why. But here's what most people don't know. The mystery of December 1872 wasn't the beginning of this ship's dark history. It was just the chapter that finally broke her for good. Because this ship had been cursed, if you believe in that sort of thing, since the very first day she ever touched water. To understand why the Mary Celeste ended up drifting crewless across the Atlantic, you have to go back not to 1872, but to 1861, and to a small shipyard on the shores of Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, where a brand new brigantine slid into the water for the very first time. She was about 100 feet long, freshly built and full of promise. The people of Nova Scotia were proud of her. The investors were optimistic. The shipyard was celebrating. And the captain who'd been chosen to take her on her maiden voyage, a man named Robert McClellan, was already sick before they even left port. Not dramatically sick, not bedridden, just off. The kind of sick where you tell yourself you'll feel better once you get some sea air. McClellan had that optimism, apparently, because he sailed anyway. He did not feel better. Within 9 days of taking command, Robert McClellan was dead from pneumonia, somewhere out on the open water. And so the very first voyage in the history of this ship, a vessel that was supposed to be hauling timber, turned into something far grimmer, bringing the captain's body home to his new wife. There is a record of her running down to the dock to meet the ship, and instead of her husband stepping off the gangway, she received a coffin. That image stuck with the crew for a long time. It stuck with everyone who heard the story, and in retrospect, it really should have been a warning. But ships are expensive and investors are optimistic, so the Amazon, that was her name, then the Amazon kept sailing. A new captain, Jack Parker, took over, and almost immediately the ship blundered into a tangle of fishing gear off Eastport, Maine, fouling her rigging badly enough that she had to sit in port for repairs before she could cross the Atlantic. Minor incident, you might say. Bad luck, you might say. Fine. But then came the Dover Strait. On a run to London, the Amazon was navigating through the Dover Strait, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world even back then, when she collided with a British sailing vessel. The impact was hard enough that the British ship went down fast, and the Amazon herself was badly damaged, limping into Dover port for her second round of repairs in what was still basically her first year of operation. 2 captains in 2 significant incidents. The investors were starting to notice a pattern, even if they weren't quite willing to say it out loud yet. Then, in 1863, while the ship was in port, undergoing yet another round of repairs, a fire broke out on board. Not catastrophic, she didn't burn to the waterline, but it was one more entry on a growing list of disasters that was beginning to look less like bad luck and more like something almost deliberate. By this point, 3 captains had been associated with this vessel. The first was dead. The second had walked away after the Dover incident, and the third, a man named William Thompson, was later reported to have drowned in 1868. Not on the Amazon, technically, but the timing felt almost personal. The final blow came in the autumn of 1867. A violent winter storm drove the Amazon hard onto the rocks at Cow Bay on Cape Breton Island. The damage was severe enough that the insurers refused to pay out the ship, had been operating outside the boundaries stipulated in her policy, apparently, and the investors didn't have the money to repair her on their own, so they walked away. The Amazon was declared a total wreck and abandoned on the beach, salt-rotted and half-buried in sand, which is honestly where the story probably should have ended. It didn't. In 1868, a man named Richard Haynes came along, looked at this waterlogged, fire-scarred, insurance-rejected hulk of a ship, and apparently saw opportunity. He bought her for $1,750, a price that tells you everything you need to know about what condition she was in, and then proceeded to spend what would be the equivalent of roughly $174,000 today to rebuild her almost from scratch. New keel, new hull planking, new masts, new rigging, new sails. When Haynes was done, she barely resembled the vessel that had wrecked on Cape Breton, and to complete the transformation, he gave her a new name, Mary Celeste, roughly translated Mary of the Heavens. It's a beautiful name, really, hopeful, clean, the kind of name you give something when you're trying very hard to make people forget what it used to be called. And for a moment it seemed to work, but only for a moment. Haynes ran into financial trouble almost immediately after the purchase, falling into debt and facing accusations of import fraud. Within 10 months of buying her, the ship he'd just poured a small fortune into was seized by creditors and sold at auction to cover what he owed. The Mary Celeste had shed the name Amazon, but whatever had been following that ship around didn't seem to care much about the rebranding. The ship passed through a couple more sets of hands before landing with a New York-based investor named James Winchester, who then sold a partial stake to a steady, respected sea captain who wanted a share of the business he was running. That captain's name was Benjamin Briggs. He was 37 years old, deeply religious, completely sober by principle, and by all accounts one of the most careful and competent sailors working the Atlantic route. If anyone could turn the fortunes of a troubled ship around, the people who knew him would have bet on Briggs. He was exactly the kind of man you'd want in command. And in the autumn of 1872, he loaded his wife and 2-year-old daughter onto the Mary Celeste and set sail for Genoa, Italy, with a hold full of industrial alcohol and every reason to expect a routine crossing. We already know how that went. By the fall of 1872, Benjamin Briggs had every reason to feel good about his life. He was 37 years old, respected in his profession, part owner of a newly refitted ship, and about to take on a well-paying cargo run from New York to Genoa, Italy. His family came from serious seafaring stock. There's even a line in his genealogy tracing back to passengers on the Mayflower, so the ocean wasn't something Briggs feared. It was something he understood. And because he understood it, he was the kind of captain who ran a tight, sober, disciplined ship. No drinking, no disorder, no unnecessary risk. He also decided to bring his family along for the crossing. His wife, Sarah, who had been his sweetheart since they were young, came aboard, and so did their 2-year-old daughter, Sophie. They packed a small melodeon, a little keyboard instrument somewhere between a harmonica and an organ, so Sarah could play music in the evenings. By all accounts, the Briggs family had a habit of making wherever they were feel like home, and the Mary Celeste was no exception. Their 7-year-old son Arthur was left behind in New York with his grandparents to continue his schooling, a decision that in retrospect saved his life. The Mary Celeste departed New York on November 7, 1872, carrying a crew of 7 and a cargo of 1,701 barrels of commercial-grade alcohol. Denatured, meaning it had been chemically treated to make it undrinkable and therefore exempt from certain import taxes. It was headed to a wine merchant in Genoa, where the alcohol would be used to fortify Italian wines. Routine cargo on paper. The kind of run Briggs had done many times before, except for one detail that made him uneasy. He had never carried a load like this before. Highly volatile, prone to vapor buildup, and sensitive to temperature changes in a way that timber or grain simply isn't. Briggs knew enough to be cautious. 8 days later, on November 15th, Captain David Morehouse sailed the Dei Gratia out of the same port on a nearly identical route headed for Gibraltar. The two ships were now crossing the same stretch of the North Atlantic, roughly in parallel, with Morehouse running slightly north of Briggs's track. Two captains, who'd shared a dinner table just weeks before, now separated by 8 days of ocean and completely unaware of what was about to happen to one of them. The early part of the voyage appears to have been uneventful. The last entry in Briggs's logbook, dated November 24th, noted the ship's position as roughly 100 miles west-southwest of Santa Maria, the southernmost island in the Azores. Position recorded. Course noted. Nothing flagged as unusual. Then the log goes silent, and whatever happened next happened without anyone writing it down. Here is where the physical evidence takes over from the paper record, and it tells a story that once you understand, it makes a certain grim kind of sense. When DeVoe and his team went through the cargo hold on December 5th, they found that 9 of the 1,800 barrels had been opened and were completely empty. Those 9 barrels were made from red oak, a slightly more porous wood than the white oak used for the rest of the cargo. Red oak absorbs moisture and breathes differently. It doesn't seal as well under pressure. And what that means in practical terms is that those 9 barrels had been slowly leaking alcohol vapor into the enclosed space of the hold for an unknown period of time. Now add one more factor, the Gulf Stream. As the Mary Celeste moved east toward the Azores, she would have passed through warmer water that raises the ambient temperature inside a sealed wooden hull. Warmer air means faster evaporation. Faster evaporation from 9 compromised barrels means a buildup of invisible, odorless, highly flammable vapor in the hold. The kind of vapor that doesn't need a flame to become dangerous. Pressure alone can do the job. And if the hull was groaning and shuddering in heavy Azores weather, which it almost certainly was given the season, the sounds coming from that hold would have been deeply alarming to anyone who knew what was stored inside. Briggs knew. And Briggs, careful, experienced, responsible Briggs, made a decision. He ordered the cargo hatch opened to vent the hold. The rush of vapor that came out may have been alarming enough on its own. A visible cloud of fumes rolling up out of the deck is not something you ignore when you're sitting on top of 1,700 barrels of alcohol. Some researchers believe there may have even been a small pressure event, not a full explosion, but a loud bang or a flash from the hatch, the kind of thing that would make a cautious man decide very quickly that no one should be standing on this ship right now. The plan, as best as historians can reconstruct it, was to abandon ship temporarily. Not permanently temporarily. The crew lowered the lifeboat, removed a section of the deck railing to make it easier to get Sarah and little Sophie down safely, and everybody got in. Then someone tied a long line, estimates put it at around 100 meters from the lifeboat, back to the Mary Celeste's stern. The idea was to trail behind the ship at a safe distance while the hold vented wait for the fumes to clear and then climb back aboard. It was a reasonable plan. Given what Briggs knew about volatile cargo, it may even have been the right call. But the North Atlantic doesn't care about reasonable plans. At some point, while that lifeboat was trailing behind the ship, 10 people in an open boat watching the Mary Celeste from 100 meters away, the line snapped. Maybe a wave caught the ship broadside and surged her forward. Maybe a squall came up fast and the wind took her. Maybe the line had been weakened by the same rough weather that had pressurized the hold in the first place. Whatever the cause, the rope parted, the Mary Celeste caught the wind in her partially set sails and began to move steadily, purposefully, as if she had somewhere to be. and the gap between the ship and the lifeboat grew from 100 meters to 200, then a quarter mile. Then more, until the ship was gone and 10 people were alone in an open boat somewhere in the Azores in late November with no way to catch her. No one in that lifeboat was ever found, no wreckage, no bodies. The Azores current and the Atlantic weather of late November would not have been kind to an overloaded open boat with no shelter, no engine, and no clear direction. The most likely conclusion, as grim as it is that the lifeboat was swamped or capsized sometime after the line broke, and that all 10 people aboard were lost to the sea within hours or days of the separation. Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, 2-year-old Sophie, and 7 sailors gone not because of a monster, not because of a mutiny, not because of anything supernatural, but because of 9 barrels made from the wrong kind of wood, a temperature change in the wrong part of the ocean, and a single rope that couldn't hold. The Mary Celeste, meanwhile, sailed on without them, undamaged, well-provisioned, perfectly intact, for 9 full days, covering roughly 500 miles of open Atlantic, before Morehouse's crew spotted her and climbed aboard to find the melodeon still sitting in the cabin, the child's impression still in the mattress, and the logbook open to an entry that was already 9 days old. Here is something that tends to happen when a mystery is compelling enough. People stop looking for the truth and start competing to tell the best story. The Mary Celeste is one of the clearest examples of that phenomenon in recorded history, because in the 150 years since Devo climbed aboard that empty ship, the case has attracted every variety of theory imaginable, from the plausible to the paranoid to the outright ridiculous, and somewhere along the way, the actual evidence got buried under about a century's worth of creative fiction. So let's dig it back out. We'll start with the criminal theories because those came first and because they were taken seriously by at least one very determined man. When Morehouse and his crew brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar as a salvage claim, they were expecting a finder's fee and a handshake. What they got instead was a prolonged criminal investigation led by a man named Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, who had decided, apparently on instinct, that something deeply criminal had occurred and that the crew of the Dei Gratia were probably responsible for it. Flood's theory was that Morehouse had conspired with Briggs or murdered him in order to claim a lucrative salvage award on a perfectly good ship. It sounds dramatic, and Flood pursued it with real conviction, examining every inch of the vessel for evidence of foul play. He found a sword under the captain's bunk with dark stains on the blade, which he declared to be human blood, and submitted as proof of violence. The subsequent chemical analysis was not kind to his theory. The stains were rust, not blood, and there was no evidence of a struggle anywhere on the ship. No broken furniture, no bullet holes, no blood anywhere that turned out to actually be blood. Flood was not deterred by this exactly, but he was eventually overruled, and Morehouse's crew received their salvage payment, though a reduced one, because the court remained just suspicious enough to penalize them for the ambiguity. The logistics of the conspiracy theory don't hold up even before you get to the lack of evidence. The Dei Gratia was a slower vessel that left port 8 days after the Mary Celeste. There is no navigational scenario in which Morehouse could have caught up to Briggs mid-ocean, committed a perfect crime that left absolutely no physical trace, disposed of 10 bodies without a single witness, and then conveniently discovered the empty ship at just the right moment. And if the goal was robbery, the robbers did a remarkably poor job. The cargo was untouched, the crew's personal belongings were still in their bunks, and the ship herself was fully intact and worth considerably more than any salvage fee. Then there's the mutiny theory, the idea that the crew got into the industrial alcohol, lost their minds, and killed the captain and his family in a drunken rampage. This one has a fatal flaw that takes about 30 seconds to identify once you know what was actually in those barrels. Denatured alcohol is not drinking alcohol. It is industrial-grade ethanol that has been chemically treated, mixed with methanol and other toxic additives specifically to make it undrinkable and therefore exempt from liquor taxes. A small amount ingested will cause blindness. A larger amount will kill you. The idea that 7 experienced sailors would voluntarily drink something that smells like paint thinner and is literally labeled as poison in quantities large enough to stage a violent mutiny is not a theory that survives contact with basic chemistry. The supernatural theories, giant squid sea monsters, alien abduction are at least entertaining, if not exactly rigorous. The giant squid hypothesis deserves a brief moment of acknowledgement simply because it was genuinely proposed by serious people and printed in serious newspapers, which tells you something interesting about the state of marine biology in the 1870s. The problem with all of them, of course, is the lifeboat and the navigation instruments and the sounding rod left on deck. Monsters, as a rule, do not prompt their victims to first gather their chronometers and sextants and carefully lower a rescue boat over the side. Whatever took those 10 people off that ship, it was something they had time to prepare for. And now we arrive at the single most damaging contribution to this case, not a theory exactly, but a piece of fiction so confidently written and so widely read that it contaminated the public understanding of the Mary Celeste for the better part of a century. In 1884, 12 years after the disappearance, a young British doctor who was between patients and apparently bored, published a short story in a magazine called Cornhill Magazine. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he had not yet invented Sherlock Holmes, but he was already very good at constructing a compelling narrative. The story was called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, and it was presented in the style of an eyewitness account, detailed, authoritative, completely believable, and almost entirely invented. Conan Doyle got the ship's name wrong, calling her the Marie Celeste instead of Mary Celeste. That incorrect name was so melodious, so slightly more exotic sounding than the original that it stuck. And to this day, you will find people arguing online about which version is correct, with the wrong one winning more often than it should. More significantly, Conan Doyle invented the detail that became the defining image of the mystery for generations. The idea that when the ship was found, there was still hot food on the table, steam rising from a fresh pot of coffee, half-eaten meals abandoned mid-bite, as though the crew had simply vanished between one mouthful and the next. It is an extraordinary image. It is also completely false. The actual boarding reports from Deveau and his crew describe a cabin that was soaking wet water had poured in through an open skylight for days, with no food on the table, no coffee, no half-eaten meals. The galley was cold. The pantry had provisions, but nothing prepared. The hot meal detail appears nowhere in the official testimony, nowhere in the court records, nowhere in any contemporary account. Conan Doyle made it up because it was a better story. And because it was a better story, everyone repeated it. And because everyone repeated it, it became the version that most people still believe today, which is a genuinely impressive feat of accidental disinformation for a man who was mostly just trying to fill pages. So if the criminal theories don't hold water, the supernatural ones don't hold logic, and the most famous version of the story was written by the creator of Sherlock Holmes as a work of fiction. What does the actual evidence point to? We covered the vapor theory in the last section, but it's worth revisiting here in the context of the physical findings because modern science has added a useful piece to that puzzle. Researchers have actually conducted experiments with alcohol vapor in enclosed spaces and found that it is entirely possible to generate what's called a pressure wave explosion, a fast, forceful release of energy that produces a loud bang and a brief flash of fire. But because the combustion happens so quickly and the cold air rushes in immediately after it leaves, no scorch marks, no soot, no lasting evidence of burning. If that happened in the Mary Celeste's hold, it would explain exactly why Briggs was alarmed enough to evacuate, but the ship showed no fire damage when DeVoe inspected her. There is also the matter of the water pump and the sounding rod. One of the ship's bilge pumps had been disassembled, the components laid out on deck mid-repair, which suggests Briggs or his crew had been trying to assess how much water was in the hold and found the pump wasn't working properly. The sounding rod, the instrument used to physically measure water depth in the bilge, was found lying on deck rather than stored in its proper place, meaning someone had been using it recently. Investigators believe the pump may have been clogged with coal residue from a previous cargo giving false readings. If Briggs was already nervous about the vapor already dealing with heavy Azores weather, and then got what appeared to be a catastrophically high water reading from a malfunctioning pump on top of whatever noise or event came from the hold, he may have genuinely believed the ship was sinking faster than she actually was. That combination of factors, faulty pump vapor event, rough seas, a cargo he'd never hauled before, and didn't fully trust a wife, and a 2-year-old aboard, would be more than enough to make even the most experienced and cautious captain decide that getting everyone off the ship right now was the only responsible choice. The tragedy isn't that Briggs panicked. The tragedy is that he was probably right to be scared, and the decision he made was probably the correct one given what he knew in that moment, and it killed everyone anyway because the rope broke. Most ships, when they become famous for the wrong reasons, get quietly retired, sold for scrap, repurposed, left to rot at a dock somewhere until they stop being someone else's problem. The Mary Celeste did not get that mercy. Instead, she spent the 12 years after the disappearance being passed from owner to owner, like something nobody wanted to touch, but nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away, which, given everything we've covered about this vessel's history, tracks perfectly. When James Winchester got the ship back in New York in September of 1873, he tried to sell her. The problem was that the story had been all over the newspapers, and the words ghost ship have a way of making prospective buyers suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be. Winchester eventually unloaded her at a loss to a firm called Cartwright and Harrison, who seemed to have believed that a change of management would change the ship's fortunes. It did not. For the next several years, the Mary Celeste worked cargo routes around the West Indies without turning a meaningful profit, which for a commercial vessel is the nautical equivalent of a slow death. In 1879, someone had the idea of using her to transport a consignment of horses around Africa, which sounds like exactly the kind of job you assign to a ship you've quietly given up on. Most of the horses died during the voyage under circumstances that were described with impressive understatement as mysterious. And in that same year, while the ship was near the island of Saint Helena, the captain, a man named Edgar Tuthill, fell suddenly and violently ill shortly after the ship made port and died within hours. He was the third captain to die while in command of this vessel, which at this point feels less like a coincidence and more like the ship was simply working through a checklist. The Mary Celeste continued changing hands through the early 1880s, each new owner presumably hoping that whatever had followed this ship through 2 decades and 3 dead captains would eventually get bored and move on. It didn't. By 1884, the ship had landed with a man named Wesley Gove, who had apparently assessed the situation, the reputation, the bad luck, the unprofitability, and arrived at the conclusion that the most sensible thing to do was to destroy the ship and collect the insurance money, which, to be fair, shows a certain kind of practical thinking, even if it is also a federal crime. Gove and his captain, a man named Gilman Parker, devised a plan that was straightforward in concept, if not in execution. They loaded the ship with a cargo they declared to be highly valuable, fine cutlery, expensive goods, the sort of manifest that would support a substantial insurance claim, and then sailed her toward the Rocheleau Bank, a shallow reef off the coast of Haiti. The plan was to run her onto the reef at full sail, let her break up on the rocks, file the claim, and walk away wealthy. Captain Parker set every sail, pointed the bow directly at the reef, and drove the Mary Celeste into it at full speed. The ship hit the reef. She was badly damaged, and then she just sat there, stubbornly, almost insultingly intact, above the waterline, perched on the rocks, like she had decided this was where she lived, now refusing to sink in any kind of timely or cooperative manner. The wreck stayed visible long enough for insurance investigators to reach her board, and discover that the valuable cargo was, in reality, a collection of trash, rotten fish, spoiled beer, and general rubbish, apparently the cheapest material Gove and Parker could find to fill the hold with, while still making it look on paper like legitimate freight. The fraud was not subtle once you were standing in the cargo hold smelling it. The insurance company declined to pay, as insurance companies tend to do when the fraud is being conducted directly in front of them. Parker Gove and their associates faced the very real possibility of a barratry conviction, the maritime equivalent of arson, which in 1884 carried the death penalty in the United States. They avoided execution, but they did not avoid what came next. Within 6 months of the trial, Captain Parker was dead, the ship's owner was dead, the first mate was dead. 3 men who had conspired to destroy the Mary Celeste were all gone within half a year of failing to do so, and none of the deaths were especially well explained. Whether you want to call that a curse, a coincidence, or simply the stress of a fraud conviction catching up with people whose health was presumably not great to begin with, the timing is at the very least remarkable. And then there were the 2 ships sent to investigate the wreck. The steam vessel Saxon and a ship called the Mary D. Douglas were both dispatched to examine what was left of the Mary Celeste on the Rocheleau Bank. Both ships were lost on their very next voyages after completing the investigation. Both lost their entire crews. There is, of course, a rational explanation for this. The waters around Haiti are notoriously difficult to navigate, and the 1880s were not a period of exceptional maritime safety, but the pattern is hard to ignore, and I will leave you to draw your own conclusions about what it means, if anything. The wreck of the Mary Celeste remained on the Rochelois bank for decades, slowly breaking apart in the tropical water until there was almost nothing left. In 2001, a team of explorers reported finding what they believed to be the final remains of the ship, a few deck nails, fragments of timber ballast stones buried under coral off the coast of Haiti. Not much to show for a vessel that spent over 2 decades being one of the most famous ships in the world. A handful of surviving artifacts, a few objects recovered over the years, are now housed at the Age of Sail Museum in Nova Scotia, which feels like a fitting final resting place for a ship that started her life in a Nova Scotia shipyard and ended it at the bottom of the Caribbean. So here is where we land 150 years later. The most likely explanation for what happened on the Mary Celeste in late November of 1872 is also, in a way, the saddest one. 10 people made a reasonable decision under terrifying circumstances, and a single rope failing at the wrong moment turned a temporary evacuation into a permanent disappearance. No monsters, no conspiracy, no supernatural intervention, just bad wood in 9 barrels, a faulty pump, a temperature change in the wrong part of the ocean, and the particular cruelty of a fraying line letting go at exactly the wrong second. Benjamin Briggs was careful and experienced and responsible, and it wasn't enough because the Atlantic doesn't grade on effort. What stays with me, and maybe what stays with you, isn't the mystery of the empty ship, as compelling as that is. It's the melodeon still sitting in the cabin. It's the impression in the child's mattress. It's the logbook open to a page that was 9 days old by the time anyone read it, recording nothing more dramatic than a routine position fix on a routine day at sea. 10 people who were simply living their lives crossing an ocean they had crossed before, and then were gone. Not with a bang, not with a struggle, but with the quiet snap of a rope in the dark and the sound of a ship sailing away without them. The Mary Celeste is gone now, dissolved into coral and salt water off the coast of Haiti. But the question she left behind, what happened to those 10 people in the hours after the last log entry, has no answer, and at this point it never will. Some mysteries don't get solved, they just get carried past from one generation to the next like a rope that nobody wants to be the one to let go of.